caught in the beast's snare. Only one man, human, could hear her scream. Stranded in an alien wilderness, her body twisted and bound by a creature unlike anything he'd ever seen. She was the prey. Desperation filled her lungs as the trap closed around her, but when the earth trembled with the sound of her scream, only one man, human, would answer the call. He wasn't supposed to care. He wasn't supposed to risk it all for an alien. But something in him couldn't ignore her pain, her cry for help. And now, with danger lurking in every shadow, he must face the ultimate test of survival and humanity. Are you ready to hear the rest of their story? Don't miss out on the next twist, the next turn, and the shocking revelations to come. Hit that subscribe button now and join us for every pulse-pounding moment. If you love high-stakes adventure, intense emotions, and edge-of-your-seat drama, this is the place for you. Stay with us because this journey is just beginning. The planet didn't speak. It moved slowly, constantly, but never loud enough to remind you it was alive. Cale Moran stood on the ridge, a silhouette against twin suns that bled rust across the horizon. Below him, a dried acid stream cut jagged through the valley floor, its banks littered with fossilized bark and stone trees shaped like twisted spears. The world stretched, barren and fractured, all the way to the broken line of mountains in the far distance. Omega, 9 was behind him, half buried in the cliff face like a scar that never healed. 3 rooms, 1 generator, a place made for isolation. He'd been alone for 43 days. He wasn't counting. Cale adjusted the weight of the scanner on his shoulder and listened to the silence. Not the quiet of sleep or peace. The kind that came after something had gone missing. The last transmission from sensor beacon D7 had dropped 2 days ago. No weather spike. No seismic shift. Just gone. Like something had swallowed the signal and decided not to spit it back. He told himself it was just corrosion. One of 100 failing systems on this rock. Fix it, record it, move on. That's what he was here for. But that was before he heard the sound. It came at first like pressure. A shift in the air. Then a note. High, impossibly thin, rising out of the cracks between the stones. Cale froze. It wasn't wind. Wasn't rock settling. It didn't even echo right. It sounded melodic. Not a word. Not quite music either. Like someone humming under their breath while bleeding out. He scanned the ridge again. Nothing. The cliffs were still. The sky too wide. The sound came again. Closer. And something in him, something buried under old armor and dry routine, stirred. He moved. The terrain fought him. Slope after slope of loose gravel, brittle stone that broke underfoot, plants that snapped shut if touched. He ducked beneath razor vine tendrils, felt the sting of mineral pollen against his skin. But the sound kept coming. He found her just before the sun dipped behind the tallest peak. Half hidden between 2 outcroppings, wrapped in a net of fractured steel and biocord, a figure hung low to the ground. Caught. Bleeding. Not human. Cale crouched low. She was tangled, limbs twisted at sharp angles. One leg bent beneath her, skin torn and smeared with dark violet blood. The trap looked old, pre-Federation salvage, crudely anchored between 2 spinewood trees. But it wasn't the trap that held his breath. It was her. Blue skin, not flat, but layered with subtle shifts of color, like moonlight on deep water. Her hair clung to her back, long and tangled, a deep green threaded with silver. She was humanoid, but not close enough to pass. Her ribs flared differently. Her joints bent wrong, and her eyes, they opened. Silver gold, slit-pupiled, luminous, and locked on him. Not pleading, not panicked, just watching. Cale didn't move. Neither did she. Then her body trembled. A sharp, involuntary motion that made the net strain and dig deeper into her thigh. She winced, gasped. The sound she made wasn't a cry. It was low, resonant, like the tail end of a chime, still echoing inside glass. He heard pain in it, but also control. She was still fighting. He stepped forward slowly. Easy, he said, even knowing she wouldn't understand. She flinched at his voice, shoulders tightening, hands scraping at the net, but didn't scream. Cale scanned the trap quickly. Military-grade steel wire. likely left by poachers. There were dried bloodstains on the rock beneath her. Old. Not hers. This place had been used before. He ground his teeth and reached into his side pouch, pulling out the heated blade. Her pupils narrowed at the sight of it. "I'm cutting you out," he said softly. She didn't nod, but she didn't move either. The wire resisted. Cale placed one gloved hand on the support bar and sliced clean through the anchor. The metal hissed. The net shifted. Her body sagged, nearly falling. He caught her. His arms slid under her back and knees. Her skin was warm, almost too warm, and slick with sweat. Light but dense, like her bones were made of something heavier than calcium. For a second, her chest pressed against his arm. Cale's breath caught. It wasn't desire. Not yet. Just surprise. At how soft she was. At how close. She didn't resist. Didn't cry out. Just watched him. Still silent. Still steady. He lifted her carefully, cradling her weight, and turned toward Omega 9. The hike back was long. The suns were fading, and the cold would come soon. Her body trembled once against his chest. Her hand slipped, unconsciously curling into his jacket. He glanced down. Still awake. Still breathing. Still not afraid. Something old stirred in Cale's chest as he walked. Not guilt. Not duty. Something closer to recognition. Like he'd been waiting for this moment longer than he'd been willing to admit. And as her breath warmed the side of his neck and the stone world darkened around them, he knew one thing. He wasn't going back to being alone. Not like before. Not now. She was burning. Not from fever. From something deeper. Like her skin had been lit from beneath. Cale could feel it even through his gloves as he carried her. Heat rising off her body in waves, warm enough to bead sweat along his spine. The exosuit's underlayer was soaked through by the time he reached the outer hatch of Omega 9. The door hissed open. Pressure equalized. Sterile air rushed to meet them, cold and dry. He stepped inside. The metal floor echoed under his boots. Her body shifted in his arms, light but dense. His grip tightened instinctively. One arm under her knees, the other wrapped across her lower back. His hand cupped her. He paused. Lower. Too low. The swell of her backside rested squarely in his palm. Firm. Curved. Still warm. He didn't mean to hold her like that. Didn't stop either. Cale laid her down on the med table gently. Her hair spilled across the dark surface like green silk unraveling in water. Her skin, her skin, looked like something carved. Smooth, yes, but not soft. There was a tautness to it, like stone just beginning to give under heat. Violet blood streaked her thigh, dried where the net had dug in deepest. He pulled off his gloves. The silence of the room pressed in around him, broken only by the low hum of power relays. No heartbeat monitor, no translator, no protocol. Just him and her, and the way her chest rose and fell. Cale opened the medkit with a breath that trembled more than he expected. He grabbed the sterilizer, sealant gel, carbon splints, and a cloth, dampened with purifier water. He knelt beside her and began. The first contact was simple, her thigh, the outer edge where the steel barbs had torn through skin. He cleaned slowly, deliberately. Her skin shivered under the cloth. Not from pain. A reflex. A response. He didn't look at her face. Didn't dare. The wound was worse than he thought. Deep, ragged, angled too close to the femoral line. If she were human, it could have meant death. If she wasn't, he didn't know. That terrified him more. His fingers slid beneath the edge of her torn suit. He had to lift it. Just enough. Just enough to clean. The fabric peeled back slowly, sticking to blood. Underneath, skin. Smooth. Blue but not cold. He ran the cloth along her inner thigh, near the joint. She inhaled. Not sharply. Just audible. Cale froze. Her leg twitched. Subtle. Barely a motion. But he felt it. He pulled back slightly. Waited. She didn't move again. Didn't open her eyes. So he continued. The wound on her hip was next. The suit there had been shredded, exposing her side, down her waist. Cale wiped blood from the curve of her flank, following the line toward her stomach. Her breathing changed. He could hear it now. She woke just before the second sun crested the ridge. No sar breath. No sudden jolt. Just a shift. like the world had remembered her. Cale was seated across the room, one hand resting on the rifle in his lap, the other on his knee. His eyes were half closed, but he wasn't asleep. The hum of the backup generator and the whisper of airflow through the vents filled the space with a steady rhythm, a rhythm that faltered when she moved. Her body arched slightly. Her head turned. Then her eyes opened. Silver, unblinking, still watching him. Cale didn't move. Neither did she. But something passed between them. Recognition, or memory, or something older. Her chest rose slowly, then fell. No words. No sound. Then, there it was. That note again. Not a voice. Not quite music. A resonant hum that started low in her chest and pulsed into the air like it was trying to shape gravity. Cale felt it vibrate in his ribs. She wasn't talking. She was feeling, out loud. He approached slowly. No sabemos. No noise beyond his boots on the floor. She followed him with her eyes. Lying still, breathing slow. He knelt beside her again, just like before. "You can hear me," he said. Her head tilted. Not a nod, but not denial. Her lips parted. Another note. This one softer. Curved like a question. Cale exhaled. "You need help." She blinked, and then he felt it. Heat, rising off her skin in waves. Her glow was returning. Not everywhere. Just certain places. Beneath her collarbone. Along the curve of her waist. At the top of her thighs. The biolight wasn't random. It was focused. Concentrated where blood ran closest to the surface. Where skin was softest. Where her body was most vulnerable. She was overheating. Cale scanned the room. No cooling blankets. No subdermal coagulante inyectes. Nothing designed for non-human anatomy. Shit. He moved quickly, pulling open the suit's upper fastenings. The fabric was stiff with dried blood, but peeled away easily. Her chest rose as he worked, the motion slow, rhythmic. Her eyes never left his. When the suit opened, heat hit him like a breath. Her skin was glowing. Soft blue light pooled along the slope of her breasts, circled her navel, shimmered faintly between her thighs. Cale hesitated. He didn't want to touch her. He wanted to. He placed a hand gently on her stomach. Warm. Almost too warm. Her skin shifted slightly under his palm, as if reaching back. He swallowed, grabbed the clean cloth again, and began to wipe. The motion was slow, careful. He ran the cloth along her ribs, then down her hip, across her waist, along the inside of her thigh. Each pass brought more light. Not bright, just alive. She was breathing deeper now, not from pain, from contact. Cale's hand brushed the side of her breast. Not by accident, not entirely on purpose. The skin there was impossibly smooth, warm, yielding. She inhaled when he touched it, but didn't move. Her eyes locked onto his. Still no fear. Still no invitation. Just acceptance. He moved higher, wiped along her collarbone, down the curve of her shoulder. His knuckles grazed the underside of her breast again. Her breath hitched. He didn't look away. He set the cloth down, pressed his bare hand flat against her stomach. Her skin pulsed beneath it. Then her hand moved. Slowly, unsteadily. She placed it over his, fingers wrapping around his wrist, holding him there. Cale didn't move, didn't speak. She lifted her other hand and touched his chest. Not pushing, not pulling, just connecting. Her fingers rested over his heart. Cale leaned closer. Her lips parted. Another note escaped. Lower this time. Resonant. It settled into him like warmth in bone. He brushed hair from her face. She turned into the touch. Cale exhaled. Voice rough. "You're burning up." She blinked slowly. Her fingers curled slightly into his chest. He moved closer, kneeling fully beside her now, body angled toward hers. Her chest rose. Fell. Rose again. The heat between them built. Not just from her. From something else. He reached again. This time to her hip. To the seal line of her lower suit. Paused. Waited. She didn't stop him. He unfastened it slowly, pulling the fabric down just enough to expose the tops of her thighs. More light. More heat. He placed one hand against the inside of her thigh. Skin to skin. She shuddered, but didn't pull away. His palm moved gently, soothing, cooling her as best he could. When he looked up, her eyes were still on him. Still unafraid. Still not asking. Just there. Open. Present. Wanted to be held. So he did. Cale slipped his arm beneath her shoulders, the other under her knees, and lifted her again. Her body folded into his, head against his neck, arms loose but not limp. Her skin blazed against him, but not with fire, with something gentler, older. He carried her to the cot, laid her down slowly, then sat beside her. She reached for him, one hand at his side, fingers curled in the fabric of his shirt. Her breathing slowed, but her touch stayed, and Cale stayed with it. Neither spoke, but nothing needed to be said. The heat had risen, and it hadn't broken them. Not yet. The sun rose without fanfare. No wind, no birds, just a pale wash of light over a sleeping world. Cale sat near the cot, one knee drawn up, a ration bar untouched in his hand. She hadn't spoken, not once, but something in the silence between them had begun to take shape. She moved differently now, not with pain, with presence. When she looked at him, it wasn't cautious. It was searching. She didn't flinch when he reached for her. She didn't startle at his voice. She followed his motions, learned his pauses, matched her breath to his, as if language were unnecessary, as if silence had weight. They spent the morning tending to basics. He cleaned equipment while she explored the room slowly, hand grazing surfaces like she could hear through her fingertips. Her glow had faded to a soft pulse, but her eyes still held silver. And when she sat across from him and tilted her head, Cale didn't need a translator to know it meant, "I'm ready." He reached forward, hand flat, palm up. She mirrored it, skin to skin, her fingers curled slightly around his. They stayed like that for a long moment. No words, no need. Later, when he checked her vitals, he pressed the scanner over her sternum, reading surface temperature, subdermal pulse, oxygen levels. But the reading glitched, unable to process alien biosigns. So he did what felt natural, removed the scanner, and placed his bare hand over her chest. Left side, where the heart should be. Her skin was cool now. The biolight under her skin shimmered faintly. He could feel the beat, subtle, syncopated, like a distant drum underwater. Her breath caught, not in protest, something else. She placed her hand over his, held it there. Cale didn't move. He could feel her pulse increase just slightly. Her eyes on him, not blinking, studying. And then she leaned forward, slow, deliberate. Two hands rose. She placed them against his face, fingertips light, like she was afraid he might vanish. His heart stuttered. The moment stretched. Then she exhaled, a low, harmonic breath that vibrated through her palms. Not a sound, a resonance. It wasn't music. It wasn't speech. It was her, inside his bones. Cale froze, his vision blurred. And then, images, not memories, not his, hers. He saw a ridge, sharp and cold, wind whipping over black stone. Two figures in armor, one female, one male. Venari, her people. She reached for him, the male. He turned away, left her behind. Pain, not rage, not betrayal like a shout, but betrayal like a whisper you never stop hearing. The image faded. Cale blinked. She was still holding his face, still breathing that note, but softer now. He reached up slowly, held her wrists, not to stop her, to stay connected. She let go, but not completely. Her hands slid down to his shoulders. Her forehead touched his. No language passed, but he understood. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of being left again. He whispered, voice low, rough with feeling, "I'm not him." She didn't respond, not in words, just closed her eyes, let out a sound like a sigh wrapped in song. And for the first time since she fell from the trap, her body fully relaxed. Against his, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they hadn't said, and everything they no longer needed to. It began with a hiss, not from the machines, not from her, from the world itself. Cale was outside, checking the solar array, when he heard it, the soft sizzle of air shifting. A smell followed, sharp and metallic, like scorched copper. He looked up. The sky was bleeding green. Rain, he muttered, eyes narrowing. Shit. He bolted inside, sealing the hatch just as the first drops hit. The sound was unmistakable. Acid rain. Cale slammed the interior lock, turned to find her already on her feet. Her eyes were wide, body tense, glowing faintly in pulses that mirrored his own racing heart. "Down," he said, gesturing toward the maintenance shaft. She didn't need translation. The two of them moved fast, grabbing the emergency pack, climbing down the ladder one after the other into the storage level beneath the station. It wasn't meant for living, just walls of composite stone and spare parts. But it was sealed, and it was safe. Barely. They reached the bottom as thunder cracked above them. The walls vibrated with distant strikes. Moisture crept in through unseen seams. The air turned cold, wet. Kale lit the backup heater. It sputtered. "Died. Great." She exhaled, curling her arms around herself. Her skin shimmered, not with heat, but with shivering biolight. Kale dropped his pack, grabbed the emergency blanket, and motioned her over. But she didn't walk. She stepped, carefully, deliberately, and then she sat, right on his lap. Kale went still, her thighs folded across his. Her weight settled warm against him. Her arms circled his neck. Her chest, bare beneath the loose, half-fastened suit, pressed against his. Skin to skin. Not sexual, just necessary. Still, his breath hitched. She was trembling. He wrapped the blanket around them both, pulling her tighter. One arm braced across her lower back, the other resting at her hip. Her skin was cold, but getting warmer. Their faces were close now. Too close. She didn't look away. She leaned in, slowly, her forehead brushing his. Then her cheek. Then her lips, not touching his mouth, but the corner of his jaw. A sound escaped her. A breath. A hum. He felt it more than heard it. His arms tightened. Her fingers dug into the fabric at his shoulder. One hand drifted down his spine. The other curled into his side. Kale whispered, "You're safe. I've got you." She pulled back just enough to look him in the eye. Her breath was fast. "Huh." Her mouth parted as if to speak, but no words came. Just another tone. Higher. Softer. Like a question. Kale's hand moved slowly along her back, up to her shoulder blade, then down to the curve of her waist. He felt her shiver. Not from fear. From recognition. She pressed closer. Her lips brushed his cheek. Not a kiss. Just contact. Then her hands lifted. One to his chest. The other to his jaw. Her eyes searched his. And she said it. A single note. A whisper. Not a word he understood. But the sound struck him like gravity. Low. Intimate. His pulse surged. He didn't know what it meant. But his soul did. He swallowed. Closed his eyes. Held her. She held back. And together, in the quiet beneath the storm, they breathed. And didn't let go. The minutes stretched, drawn out by the dull hiss of rain pounding the structure above. Time blurred. Kale could feel her heartbeat against his chest, no longer erratic but steady, syncing with his. Her skin warmed gradually beneath the blanket, tension melting from her shoulders. She tilted her head slightly and rested her cheek against the side of his neck, her breath brushing soft over his skin. He felt something primal inside him quiet, the kind of peace that doesn't shout or sing, just settles into your bones like warmth. She wasn't just here for protection anymore. She was choosing to stay close. Every subtle movement, the curve of her knee against his side, the slow exhale between parted lips, the fingertips brushing his collar, carried the weight of quiet trust. Kale ran his hand slowly along her back, then stopped at the small of it, resting there as if anchoring her. She didn't resist. Her own hand slid up to the side of his face, thumb brushing the edge of his jaw. Her eyes met his again, and he thought he saw something behind the silver sheen. Grief, yes, but also hope. They didn't speak. There was no need. The storm outside gave them this moment. A stillness no words could match. Then she leaned in one last time, her forehead pressing lightly against his. Her breath trembled, carrying another sound. A single syllable he couldn't decipher, but it resonated through him like a note struck on a wire deep beneath the earth. His heart reacted before his mind did, thudding hard at his chest. He didn't know what the word meant, but it felt like home, and he knew, whatever came next, they would face it together. Long after the storm had passed, the walls of Omega 9 still breathed with dampness. Outside, The world steamed and hissed, rain leaving behind pitted stone and poisonous glisten. Inside, the silence stretched. Rayla sat with her back to Kale, half wrapped in the blanket they'd shared through the night. The emergency lighting painted her skin in low amber, tracing the outline of her shoulders, the dip of her spine, the curve of her hips beneath the unsealed suit. She hadn't moved much since the storm ended. Neither had he. Kale watched her, and then he saw it. When she shifted slightly, leaning forward to pick up the canteen, the light struck her back at a new angle, and something shimmered. Not moisture, not biolight. Symbols. Fine lines, intricate curves, etched like silver threads just beneath the surface of her skin. Not tattoos, not scars. Something living, reactive. The designs pulsed softly as she breathed, an echo of the life beneath them. He rose slowly, careful not to startle her. "Rayla," he said gently. She turned, just enough to see him over her shoulder. Her expression was calm, not surprised. He stepped closer. She didn't stop him. He knelt behind her, hand hovering inches from her back. "May I?" She didn't answer with words, just reached up and pulled the blanket from her shoulders, letting it fall to her waist. The markings spread across her upper back, delicate and flowing. Each symbol was different, a spiral, a jagged arc, a branching line like a root system. Kale reached out and touched the edge of one with a fingertip. The instant he made contact, the room faded. He was somewhere else. A memory, but not his own. He stood beneath a sky of deep violet, beside a body of still water. A figure, Rayla, but younger, sat with others who looked like her. Laughter echoed. A family. A beginning. He blinked. The vision vanished. He touched another symbol, lower, near her waist. Heat. Movement. A body pressed to hers in passion, in intimacy. Kale felt the pulse of love, of trust, of surrender. And then he felt it break. Another touch. Pain. Cold cliffs. Hands gripping hers. Letting go. She had fallen, or been pushed. Kale gasped and pulled his hand back. Rayla turned slightly. Her eyes shimmered. She reached for his hand and guided it to her side, to another mark he hadn't noticed. He touched it and saw her running, alone, desperate, through canyons and ruined valleys. Her breathing ragged, her voice lost, fear behind her, silence ahead. She let go of his hand and waited. Kale sat back on his heels. His throat felt tight. The images weren't just glimpses. They were pieces of her soul. He looked at her, really looked. Her back still glowed faintly with the remnants of memory. Her shoulders were bare, vulnerable, but she held herself with quiet strength. He reached up, gently touching her nape where the markings converged. Her breath caught, not from pain, from being seen. Kale leaned forward, resting his forehead lightly against the back of her neck. He didn't speak, just breathed with her. More markings lay further down her spine, each one delicate and unique, almost like a personal constellation. Kale followed the trail with his fingers, moving lower toward the small of her back, pausing with each symbol. Every contact opened a door, some flooded with warmth, others chilled with sorrow. He saw brief flashes of her world, a temple beneath a sea of glass, a sibling lost in a storm, a ritual performed under 3 moons, her body arching in silent grief beside an unmarked grave. All of it was emotion etched into skin. He could barely breathe through it. Each memory he touched came with weight. Not just what she lived through, but what she carried. These markings weren't decoration. They were history, and Kale began to understand. Every inch of her had been shaped by things she could not say. This was her voice. As he moved his hand up again, brushing lightly over her shoulder and along the side of her neck, Rayla turned her face toward him. Their eyes met, silver and human brown. Something passed in that gaze. Not just longing, not fear. It was acknowledgement of closeness, of risk, of surrender. She shifted slowly, folding her legs beneath her, and leaned into him. Her forehead pressed to his collarbone. One hand slid across his chest, then paused at the center of it. Her fingers spread wide. She could feel the rhythm of his heart. Kale wrapped his arms around her, holding her with quiet care. And then she whispered, "Words. Don't leave." 2 syllables. Fragile. Fluent. He froze, pulled back just enough to see her profile. Her eyes were closed. Her lips parted slightly, but the words had come from her. Real. Deliberate. Cale's chest tightened. He reached around, slowly, sliding one arm across her waist, pulling her gently into him. She leaned back, her head against his shoulder, her body folding into the space he offered like it had always belonged there. He didn't answer with words. He held her, because now he knew he hadn't just saved her life. He was part of it, and she was part of his. She wasn't asking for shelter. She was offering it too. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by symbols and silence, and the ghost of rain still dripping beyond the steel, Cale felt something settle deep in his bones. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew what now was. It was hers. It was his. It was theirs. The signal went out before either of them realized. Rayla had been sleeping, her head tucked against Cale's chest, body curled within the shelter of his arms. The storm had passed, the heat returning to the canyon, and they had climbed from the underground chamber only to find the sky already beginning to boil with haze. He had gone to check the comms panel, fingers gliding over the controls. The satellite uplink still pulsed, but something else blinked, an echo frequency too sharp to be automated. Cale frowned. Rayla stirred the moment he touched the console. Her glow returned in short flickers. Her eyes opened, silver glinting with unease. "What is it?" she asked, her voice still fragile, but steadier than before. "Something pinged us back," Cale said. "Not from orbit. Ground-based. Stronger than local mining signals." "Track." Rayla's posture stiffened. Her fingers curled into the edge of the cot. "They heard me," she whispered. Cale turned. "Who?" She stood slowly, her bare feet silent on the floor. "The ones I ran from." Before he could press further, the motion sensor chirped. Something was moving outside the ridge. Cale grabbed the rifle. They slipped through the side access hatch, down the slope behind Omega 9, moving along the weathered cliffs. He knew the terrain, or thought he did, but Rayla guided him deeper, toward a narrow passage half hidden by razor vine. A fissure in the canyon wall. "This way," she said. They ducked into the darkness just as shadows crested the ridge. 5 figures, clad in mismatched armor and dusted with the rust of the planet. Not soldiers, not explorers, scavengers, poachers. Rayla clutched Cale's arm as they watched from the shadows. Her body trembled against his side. The fear wasn't for herself. It was memory. He leaned close. "What do they want?" She didn't look away. "Me. Or rather, what's inside me. The bond matrix. They used me to test it. I escaped." Cale felt his blood go cold. They moved again, deeper into the hidden canyon path. The walls narrowed. Fungi clung to the rocks, glowing with soft biolight. Roots pulsed beneath their feet. When they reached a split in the rock, barely wide enough for one person to slip through, Rayla hesitated. Cale motioned. "Go." She pressed into the crack, hips wedging briefly. Cale stepped behind her, hands braced on the stone. He reached forward, hands gripping her waist. "I need to push," he muttered. Her breath hitched. He pushed gently, one hand sliding down her side, the other bracing her lower back. Her body pressed into the stone, chest rising as she exhaled. Her hips moved forward. Not far. Not enough. Cale shifted closer, his chest flushed to her back. His hands slid lower, gripping under her thighs, and lifted. She gasped. He pressed forward, breath on her neck, heart pounding. "Almost," he whispered. She moved, twisted, slid through. He followed. They tumbled onto a ledge, breathless, dust in their mouths, silence behind them. They lay there, panting, close, too close, her hair against his jaw, his hand still on her hip. She turned, their faces inches apart. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't answer. Their foreheads touched. Bret mit Bret. She didn't flinch when his hand lifted to her face. He didn't tremble when she leaned forward. The kiss was slow, necessary, not hunger, survival. The world narrowed to that contact. Her fingers curled into his chest. His lips shaped to hers. The silence was no longer fear. It was promise. They didn't stay on the ledge long. The poachers were still above, combing the canyon with sensor packs and old-world rifles, the kind that punched through rock and armor alike. Every second spent lingering was another breath stolen from their odds of survival. Cale helped Rayla to her feet, his hand lingering a heartbeat too long at her waist. Neither of them spoke of the kiss, not yet. It still clung to their mouths, warm and fragile. There wasn't time to give it shape. They moved quickly, following the seam of the rock until it opened into a bioluminescent cavern veined with root light and the thrum of ancient groundwater. Rayla moved like she'd been there before. Cale followed close behind, scanning every corner for motion. His grip on the rifle was tighter than he realized. Behind them, the sounds of the poacher team grew closer. Echoes bounced strangely in the cave, masking direction. They couldn't outrun this forever. Rayla paused at a fork in the cavern, breathing hard. Her skin shimmered from exertion, biolight blooming along her collarbone and down her arms. She pressed a hand to the wall. Something pulsed beneath it, an old energy line. Maybe alien, maybe human salvage. Either way, it responded to her touch. A door hissed open, concealed behind what looked like stone. Beyond it lay a narrow chamber, metal-lined, half-collapsed, smelling of rust and silence. "We hide," she said. "Only for a moment." Cale nodded. They slipped inside, sealing the door behind them. The space was barely wide enough for them to sit, let alone breathe, comfortably. Cale crouched low, rifle across his knees, while Rayla leaned against the wall, sweat glistening at her temples. He could feel her breath more than hear it. The closeness was unbearable and necessary. She turned toward him, eyes searching his face in the dim blue light. "I didn't mean to send the signal," she whispered. "The Matrix, it calls when I'm afraid." "It's not your fault," Cale said. He reached out without thinking, brushing hair from her cheek. "They shouldn't have put that thing in you." Her smile was thin, bitter. "They said it would help us understand your kind. Translate not just words, but emotion. But it grew too deep. Started shaping my own memories. Like I was becoming the experiment." He watched her, jaw tight. "You're not anyone's test subject now." A rumble overhead cut through the silence. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. Boots on stone. Cale cursed under his breath. He looked around. No other exits. Only the wall. The tension bled back into his limbs, battle readiness mixing with something more desperate. Rayla moved suddenly, crawling across the narrow space and kneeling beside him. Her hand found his. "If they find us," she began, but he shook his head. "They won't." "If they do," she insisted, voice low but fierce, "then remember this." She leaned in, slowly, deliberately. Her hand slid behind his neck. And again, their lips met. This kiss was different. No longer just survival. It was defiance. A flare of truth in a world full of silence and betrayal. Her body leaned into his, arms slipping around his waist. Cale dropped the rifle beside him, both hands rising to cradle her back. Their breaths mingled, ragged and full of something that might have been longing or fear or the first spark of something dangerously close to hope. They didn't speak afterward. They didn't need to. When the steps faded above them, when the echoes of danger withdrew into the canyons, they sat pressed together in that narrow space, hearts loud in the quiet. Cale whispered, lips brushing her temple. "Next time we run first." Rayla smiled faintly. "Next time we fight." Outside, the wind began to shift. The planet wasn't done with them, and neither were the ones hunting her. But for now, in this stolen moment, Cale and Rayla knew exactly where they stood. Together. Cale stood alone above the relay tower, its skeletal dish still broken, still blinking that steady, useless pulse into the sky. The uplink was active, but only just. He had patched it by hand 3 days ago, using stripped wire, hope, and leftover guilt. Somewhere out there, someone might be listening. Someone might even be coming. But the question was no longer whether help would arrive. It was whether he wanted it to. The choice came quietly. He opened the panel, pulled the signal core, took out the fusion chip. It glowed like a cage star. He looked at it for a long time. Then he crushed it with the heel of his boot. The silence that followed was total. No more echoes to space. No more calls home. No more waiting for orders. When he returned to Rayla, she didn't speak. She just looked at him, and somehow she knew. She reached for his hand, her fingers cold, light pulsed beneath the skin. No words passed. None needed to. She leaned into him as they descended deeper into the ridge, past roots and stone and sediment, until they found the chamber she had once only spoken of in fragments. The room with no sound. Not silence. The absence of everything. Even their footsteps vanished as they entered. Their breath made no echo. The air hummed with quiet that felt ancient. Kale looked around. Bioluminescent moss clung to the walls. The floor was smooth, warm, slightly damp like skin. The air pressed close. Emotions sharpened in the void. She had warned him, but nothing prepared him for the way it pulled every feeling to the surface. Fear, desire, memory. Each breath heavier than the last. Rayla stepped into the center of the room. Her skin began to glow, soft blue spreading from her heart outward. She turned, eyes bright, watching him like he was the only anchor she had. "Kale," she said, and the word carried weight even here. "I don't belong anywhere anymore. Not to the stars. Not to the scientists who made me. Not even to the silence." She walked to him, slow, her biolight pulsing. "Only in the way you look at me. I remember I exist." His heart lurched. She touched his chest. He breathed in deeply. Her hands slid up, over his shoulders, down his arms. Then she leaned in, lips brushing his jaw, not quite kissing, just anchoring. Kale pulled her close. She unfastened the upper edge of her suit. It slipped down her shoulders, bearing skin that shimmered like moonlight poured over water. She watched him as he helped, slow, reverent. His fingertips grazed her waist, her hips, the curve of her lower back. Her breath caught when he touched the small of her back. Their mouths met, and this time it was not survival or defiance. It was surrender. They lowered themselves to the floor, bodies aligned like gravity had finally brought them together. His hand trailed down her thigh, across the curve of her hip, and up again, tracing the glow in her skin. Her legs wrapped around him. One hand found his cheek, the other pressed to his heartbeat. They breathed each other, skin to skin, every inch alive. There were no commands, no rules, just movement and response. The way her fingers followed the slope of his spine, the way his lips found the hollow at her throat, the way her chest lifted to meet him, not with urgency, but with devotion. Her skin sang beneath his touch, light pulsing as he ran his hand from her ribs to the line of her stomach. Her hips tilted, her breath hitched. Their eyes met. No sham, no fear, just presence. She whispered something in her language, a syllable that struck him like thunder in the quiet. He repeated it back to her, clumsy but sincere. She smiled, then drew him in again. They moved together, not in haste, but in resonance. Every breath matched, every heartbeat shared. When she gasped, it was not pain. When he shuddered, it was not control. When they stilled, finally, it was not the end. It was the beginning. In that room, without sound, their love became the loudest truth on the planet. And they didn't need the stars to witness it. Only each other. The world did not change after. Not in any grand way. The poachers did not return that night. The stars did not fall. The silence held. And yet, everything was different. Kale woke first, her breath warm against his neck, one arm draped over his ribs. Her skin still glowed faintly, not from fear or adrenaline, but from rest, from peace, from belonging. He traced the shape of her fingers lightly. They had both chosen this, not as a rebellion, not as defiance, but as a quiet truth. They didn't speak much that morning. They didn't need to. The soundless chamber carried their movements like echoes of breath, not conversation. Kale packed their things while Rayla drew her markings onto a scrap of cloth, symbols from her skin, transcribed like memory, saved for later. Her last one was the smallest, 2 spirals touching. It was new. They surfaced by midday, the twin suns blazing pale gold above the canyon. The wind had shifted. The world smelled of scorched iron and waiting. Kale scanned the ridge with his rifle and spotted it first. Movement far off, a shimmer in the dust. Not poachers, sleeker silhouettes, Government surveyors. They found us, he said. Rayla stood beside him, silent. A small craft descended by the old relay site within the hour. Not military, but not harmless either. 3 figures emerged, suits gleaming, faces unreadable. One raised a hand in greeting. The other carried a scanner already trained on Rayla. Kale stepped in front of her. They didn't draw weapons. Not yet. Kale Moran, one said through the translator. We received the initial pulse weeks ago. You were listed missing. I'm not missing, he said evenly. I'm here. Their eyes flicked to Rayla. And she's not your concern. The lead figure stepped forward. The data signature in her body is proprietary. She is a living asset. Violation of contact law. She's not an asset, Kale growled. She's a person. You lost her. I found her. She chose to stay lost. There was a pause. Rayla stepped forward. Her voice was soft but unshaking. I will not go back. Not to research. Not to silence. The translator buzzed, almost hesitant. She speaks, one of them murmured, without augmentation. She learned, Kale said. With me. Negotiation was brief. Tense. The team wanted data. She offered memory. One symbol. One truth. Kale stood beside her, hand in hers. The translator took her offering, but nothing more. They left without force. And Kale didn't look back. That night, they returned to the chamber with no sound. Not to hide. To mark the end. Rayla added a final symbol to the cloth, a circle within a circle. A pulse. She held it to her heart, then folded it carefully and handed it to Kale. What does it mean? He asked. That I am not afraid, she said. They built a new shelter near the basin's edge. Small, strong, solar-fed. Half it was old tech, half of it hers. The air around them changed, somehow. The wind didn't scream anymore. It whispered. The planet, once a grave, had become ground. Weeks passed, then months. They explored, mapped, cataloged, and every night, Kale would trace the scars on her back with fingertips full of reverence. She would whisper his name, not as a need, but as a promise. She never called him savior, and he never asked her to, because it wasn't about saving. It was about choosing. And in the quiet beyond empires, beyond machines, beyond all the noise of stars and science and survival, they chose each other, over and over, until even silence became a song.